All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our latest edition of Med Mentor Mondays. Hopefully you've been able to catch some of our previous sessions before in the earlier part of this year, but we're back up and ready to go. So today's session is going to be on interview tips, as we are sort of in the midst of interview season. For many of you, it's probably something that's very stressful right now, and we hope to be able to answer any questions that you have. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists right now. I'm going to be sort of moderating and playing a backseat role. So Megan, maybe you want to start us off, and then we can popcorn style around.
Yeah, just a quick introduction. I've been at a few of these Med Mentor Mondays before, but I'm Megan. I'm a second-year med student here at UCLA. I went to Berkeley for undergrad. I know it's going to be a common theme for us here during this meeting. Very excited to share some tips and tricks. I know things have had a huge change this year, so we know that's probably a little bit confusing, and hopefully we can provide some clarity.
Cool, I'll go next. I'm Anna. I'm also a second year, and I've also appeared in a good number of these, so you're used to hearing our advice. I also went to Berkeley. Wow, this is crazy. Go Bears. Yeah, we've done our best to kind of inform you about the new interview styles in this presentation today. We'll also be talking about our experiences with these interviews, but obviously it's going to be a little different for you. So hopefully it's still a helpful, useful session, and yeah, we're excited to share our knowledge with you.
Hey everyone, I'm Audrey. I am also a second-year medical student, and unlike the other medical students who are present in this call, I did not go to Berkeley. I went to UCLA actually, so go Bruins, supporting, representing myself. It's also my first session with Med Mentor, so hopefully I can provide a different perspective, and I'm also excited to share with you all my experiences and hopefully provide as much help as I can for this journey, because it's especially challenging, but even more so right now. So thanks for being here.
All right, thank you, panelists. I think many of you, if you have watched previous sessions, you know me. I'm Ryan, MS2 as well, with everyone here. Also went to Berkeley, so sort of outnumbering the Bruins right now. But you guys in the attendees section will certainly outnumber us. But anyway, so today we're going to sort of be bouncing back and forth between a PowerPoint presentation and the panel style, which is, I think, something you have expressed already. So we'll just get right into it. Here we go. Is this functioning properly? Okay, all right, so today's session on medical school interview tips. So there are a bunch of different types of interviews out there, and you've probably heard of a number of them, but some of them might be a little bit newer. Here we've just tried to outline a little bit about sort of what you can expect in terms of the people that will be present for any of these different types of interviews, as well as how long they will be and how many of them you can expect. So the traditional ones are probably the ones you're most aware of, where usually it's going to be sort of a one-on-one between you and a faculty member, and it's half an hour to maybe a little bit longer depending on the school. They will usually have several of these, so it's a good idea to be prepared for an endurance marathon, if you will, because it can be quite tiring in the end. There are also a couple schools out there that do group and panel styles. So these two are a little bit different in the sense that you will be present not only with one other person in the room, but in the group style, you have usually many different types of applicants with you. And in the panel style, usually it'll be yourself with a number of faculty who are interviewing you. MMIs are something you may have heard of as well. These are the multiple mini interviews, and this is sort of a more recent trend in medical school application processes. And we'll dive into a little bit about that. And then Vita is probably the latest one, and we'll touch on that a little bit towards the end. And this will probably be relevant given sort of the current circumstances of COVID. So unfortunately, because of our pandemic situation right now, all of these are probably going to be virtual for you. Hopefully they'll be able to make it as engaging of a process as possible, because the virtual experience is certainly not going to recapitulate the in-person experience, but we'll do our best to try to give you tips on how to approach all of these in the virtual setting as well. So the traditional interview is sort of the one you're most familiar with, and you can expect the people interviewing you to be faculty, residents, perhaps other medical students, or even administrators. And the type of style that this interview usually takes is going to be anywhere from an open file discussion or a closed file discussion. And what this means is that for the open file, this indicates that essentially the person interviewing you has had a chance to review your entire file, if they please, and pretty much they have fair access to all of your primary and secondary information. For a closed file interview, that's actually going to be the other side of things, where they will walk into that room not knowing anything about you besides probably your name and where you are applying from. So those two different styles will obviously influence the information and the questions they'll ask. But it's important to know that a lot of us think about interviews as gauging student interest in the school. And so this is sort of the faculty perspective, right? Like they want to see how interested is the students in the school and what do they have to bring to the school. But something that I would really encourage you to also think about is that these types of interviews are also an opportunity for you to gauge your interest in school. So I think this might be a typo, gauge school interest in the school. I should say gauge school interest in the student. So it's sort of a two-way street in the sense that you are having an opportunity to learn about this institution and what it has to offer. They have an opportunity to learn about you and what you have to offer. And it's not a one-way street in terms of that evaluation process. So definitely go in also being keen on the types of information that you can elicit from your faculty, the experience, everything. You can expect a number of different types of questions. You're probably sort of anticipating some of the standard ones, and we'll go into that a little bit. But there are also some unexpected questions that you could also get. So examples of some of these questions that you have probably started to prepare for or anticipated are shown on the screen here. We won't really go into every single one of them. These are just sort of provided for your reference in case you want to prepare and see what to expect. But do know that there is no sort of script for any of these, in the sense that you have no idea what is going to show up on your interview. So it's good to have answers that are prepared for these, but not in sort of a memorized sense. I think this is sort of outlined here as well. So it's good to know and anticipate what sorts of questions you'll be asked. An important point here is that you should review your primary application and your secondary application very closely to see if there's anything at all that you can think of that a faculty member or someone interviewing you might be drawn to. So for example, I took the MCAT twice, and that will show up on my application. So that would certainly be a point of contention perhaps during an interview. And so if you have something like that, you would want to prepare for it and have an answer. That being said, you don't want to memorize your answers. You know, it can be very obvious if you have a script prepared and you're reading from a script in your head. They will be able to pick on that very easily. Your goal is to make it a very natural conversation that's organic and doesn't require any sort of strain on either side. Of course, you want to review all of your application materials. So for the open discussion or the open file discussions, you can expect that literally anything you've put from your most important work and activities section down to a sentence that you listed about an extracurricular activity in your secondaries, all of that is fair game. So you really should know everything about your application and be prepared to talk about it if it comes up. And last point here is sort of a little obvious, but I think some people may be so caught up with preparing for the interview itself that they forget to touch on this point, is that you really want to be prepared to explain why you're interested in the school and have some reasons why in terms of knowing things about the school. So a generic answer in the sense of, oh, I'm really excited about this school because of its emphasis on global health or its dedication to community service. That's sort of a more generic answer that perhaps won't carry as much weight as something else that might be a little bit more specific. So at the end, usually many interviewers will ask, do you have any questions for me? And your answer should always be yes. You don't want to say, no, actually, I think I'm good. I think we touched on everything. Even if you don't have anything in your back pocket for this, you still should answer yes and then try to come up with something, because that is sort of going to be a gauging point in terms of your interest in the school. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing screens and we'll turn it over to the panelists. And perhaps panelists, maybe you can describe some experiences you had with the traditional style interview. And Audrey, maybe you want to kick us off here.
Sure. I think one thing to note for traditional style is the variation in the types of people that can interview you. So unfortunately, you might get along or you might not get along with an interviewer at a particular school versus like maybe another school you just happen to like have a lot in common with the person that you're interviewing with. So keep that in mind. It's not always a reflection of yourself, but sometimes it's like factors that are out of your control. But one way to really get around that and to kind of heighten your chances of doing well in a traditional interview is often at the like the day of your interview, or maybe like ahead of time, the school will provide you with the name and the potentially like department of the person who's interviewing you. Sometimes it's faculty, sometimes it's a medical student or a PhD person. But what you want to do is essentially like kind of research them ahead of time, see what type of work they've done, see what types of research they've done, what their journey was to their current profession, and try to see what commonalities you might want to highlight in your interview with them. So you can kind of like have something in common. You kind of have an idea of what type of person they are. So that's one thing. And then on another point is like for yourself, try to, with every interview, have a diverse set of stories that highlight your experiences that would be a good fit for the school. So for example, like Ryan said, if a school seems to have a lot of emphasis on global health and you have some experiences related to global health and you want to like kind of say, oh, well, I really like this program because of global health options. You can kind of like solidify your answer even more by painting those stories and experiences related to that to really make you more memorable and strengthen your interview. I'll pass it over to Megan and Anna if they want to share additional tips.
Okay. I guess I will go. There's just one thing that I remember after interviewing that was a takeaway for me for traditional interviews. And one thing Ryan really mentioned was not to sound scripted. But another thing I would add to that is sometimes you're answering the same question at multiple interviews or multiple times in the same day. So I would just try and think of multiple examples to answer any one question. It might be that your tell me about yourself is going to sound pretty similar, but you can always switch up the order you talk about it in or which hobbies you talk about. Just because after a while it's really going to sound like scripted, even though it's not, just because you said it so many times and you know what you're going to say. So just try and switch it up a little bit, throw in a joke somewhere. I think it's really great. It's a very serious interview, of course, but you want to appear personable and someone that can have a conversation. You're trying to be a doctor, and doctors do have to talk to patients all the time. And we always love a doctor that's a little bit less formal and too straightforward. So we want something a little bit more relaxed. And then the other thing that I found was really helpful before approaching traditional interviews was actually seeing if I had any friends that went to that med school and asking what they loved best about the med school. That way you can say, oh, like I have a friend and they've told me, these amazing things about your school, and it just makes me so sure that I want to be here. And on top of that, I have friends here and I also have a community here. And having a community at a school really hits home with all interviewers, whether they're students or physicians. Because it's something that's important to your success at school, and your desire to be there and have fun is really going to make a difference, especially right now when it's sometimes hard to have a good, strong community with everything being virtual. Saying that someone that is really like convincing you this is the best possible place for you, I think is beneficial.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I wanted to touch on something Audrey mentioned, like you may not get along with like every single interviewer, like you may not be like totally compatible with them, and that's totally okay. And I just want to like kind of put this out there. I don't think it's a very common thing to happen, but it's possible, and you should just have it in the back of your mind that stress interviews are a real thing. And so if you get an interviewer that's really kind of pushing back on your responses, just keep in mind that it may not be your responses that are wrong. It may be just the interviewer was told to challenge you and see kind of how you respond to that. So kind of my tip for that is to always like just be prepared for those scenarios and don't let it affect like your future performance in the interview. Just keep your cool, keep moving on. Like if you have a really good point, stick to it. And don't let it kind of throw off either your future stations, like with the next interviewer, or the rest of your questioning. Because I have talked about in these sessions before, I didn't have like the highest GPA my freshman year, and an interviewer flat out asked me, he was looking at my transcript and he's like, explain these C's your freshman year. I was like, oh God, I don't know, I was a freshman, which just really like threw me off at the very beginning of an interview, but I was able to like kind of bounce back from that and tell him, yes, I didn't do great my freshman year, but I've grown from that. I am a really strong student now. Like, these are the examples to prove that. And we ended up getting along really well by the end of the interview. So just to be prepared that these difficult questions may come up, and you're allowed to just take a breath, take a pause, think about your answer for a second, and then dive into it. It's going to be okay. So there's something to be prepared for in traditional interviews. So it's not super common, but it may happen.
Yeah, I actually had a similar experience. I had an interviewer flat out to my face that he didn't think I should be in the program. So like you can get sort of a spectrum of things. You can have someone who is really excited to meet you and they want to learn everything they can about you. And you can have someone else who, after you tell them sort of your lifelong dream to go to med school and to do what you want to do, they say, you know, I don't think you should be here. And I think the point to take away from that is exactly what Anna was saying, in the sense that it's very challenging, but if you do experience something like that, you really want to try to stay on track. Don't let it fluster you, and especially don't let it affect sort of what's coming down in the future interviews you have, if you have more that day. Every interview is usually going to be a clean slate interview in the interim. So if you had a session that perhaps you think didn't go your way the first time around, you have another one in maybe the afternoon, just start over, do a breathing exercise or something to calm your nerves, and it'll be all just fine. I think I actually skipped a slide in this section that we had, so I'm going to go back to that before coming back to our panelists really quickly. So give me 1 second here. I know some of you are asking about some of the types of questions that you can ask. So at the end of a traditional interviewer, you can certainly ask about your interviewer specifically. So things about their specialty, their path to medicine, or even why that specific school. This second one actually can be very interesting, because they might tell you some things that might help you in making a decision at the end as well. Advice is always good to have, and you know, the favorite things about medicine. This might even get you starting to think about the fields of medicine that you want to pursue as well. And as we mentioned, school-specific questions are often better than the general ones, so definitely try to go that route if you can. So another question I have for the panelists, sort of in regards to traditional interviews, is, you know, that there are a lot of questions out there that sort of we can anticipate. The why medicine, why our school. But what was the weirdest question that just came straight out of left field that you were not expecting at all? And I know that might be like a weird question to ask it now. So to give you some time to think, I'll talk about one that I had. When I was interviewing, it was actually at UCLA, which was my first interview. It was my first interview in the morning as well. So 8 a.m., smack, straight out of left field. I have an interviewer saying, you know, there are a lot of things that I call aha moments in our lives, where something is happening. What was your greatest aha moment? And, you know, I was just sitting there for a good like 10, 15 seconds, just not having any clue on what to say. And so you can have questions that you're not prepared for at all. And I would say that the approach that you want to take in that moment is, as Anna said, it's okay to take a moment of silence. You don't have to just bolt straight out of the gate into a response and have something prepared. What's most important is your thought process. So if you can walk your way through it in terms of the question and sort of why, oh, you know, my aha moment was this, and the reason that I would consider that my aha moment is X, Y, and Z, that will sort of provide an explanation for the interviewer that will not only give you a logical structure for answering their question, but also something that they can remember. Because chances are they'll remember more of the non-traditional interview style questions. If they ask why medicine, they'll probably get similar responses from everyone. So the atypical questions can actually be a really interesting chance for you to make yourself like remembered. But yeah, did any of you guys have any really weird questions flying out of left field that you did not anticipate?
So I didn't have like any weird questions like that, but I did have some questions that did kind of like make me like, oh, wait, let me think about that for a second. So it's not like an aha question, sorry, right? But it was more like, so when I was interviewing at one of the schools, I told them about some of my experiences, in particular like research and health technology. And the traditional interviewer kind of seemed to go off script for a second, and he kind of was like, oh, so what do you think about technology in healthcare? It was like so open-ended, like just very kind of like, I don't know, I was kind of not expecting it, I guess, because it felt like he wanted to know my like opinion on something that was very like systemic. So I thought that was an interesting kind of like segue in the conversation, because it gave me a chance to kind of share my perspective, and also demonstrate, like Ryan said, kind of like your ability to process information and describe your awareness, and that's basically of how the healthcare system is run. And so I think part of me was glad that I had done a little bit of research into like the US healthcare system and had like an understanding of technology in healthcare. But it was like, I think one of those questions where I was a little bit surprised, but also glad that I received it. But it kind of goes to show you kind of need to do a little bit of like studying and preparation beforehand in case people come back from your responses with follow-up questions that might seem to challenge you or question why you do certain activities.
Again, not really like a really interesting question, but just one that like totally threw me off. An interviewer asked me what I didn't like about my job. And for reference, I was working in clinical research, and it turned out that my interviewer also did clinical research. And that's why he was asking. But it was just surprising because so much of the interview is about positives and, you know, why you'd be a good fit, why you're excited for medicine, and to have someone just ask me something so clearly like asking for negative aspects was difficult. And I definitely had to take a moment, because I didn't want to just be like, oh, my manager sucks. You know, that's like the first thought that, you know, you like your immediate gripes with your job. But it was something where I was like, oh, give me a moment. I haven't really thought about that. I really constructed that answer well, so that didn't come off as, I don't know, a bit too complaining type tone. That I think was one thing that just like completely threw me off. I had to take like 20 seconds, 30 seconds to actually think about it, and it was totally fine. And afterwards, it turned out that the interviewer kind of agreed with some of my thoughts. So even if it feels like out of left field, it might turn out completely okay. So.
Yeah, I feel like the weirdest question I got was someone calling out my grades. So I don't have any more to add that I can think of, but.
Oh, wait, sorry. I was just going to add to Megan's point. That reminded me, I also got a question like that as well. It was about one of my activities where it was like, so what did you not like about that experience? Because he had kind of seen that I had not done it throughout my entire time in college. Like I had kind of like stopped halfway. He was like, oh, what did you like? So then I also had the same kind of guttural reaction where I was like, oh, maybe I should tell him about like difficulties working with other people or something. But I think it's just when you're answering that question, you just want to be honest, but you also want to try to still spin like a positive light on it, I think, if possible, and show like how you grew from that experience, if there was something you didn't really like about a particular experience.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for sharing. So we have a question in the Q&A actually coming through that I thought would be interesting to ask here, because it's sort of related in the sense that you have the traditional usually faculty members or medical students and whatnot, but sometimes there are other activities during the day which might be scheduled, and that could include things like socials or the orientation meetings or anything like that. Are you being evaluated during those sessions, and how should you sort of behave during those?
I think it's hard to say because, we're not privy to like the admissions processes at every school. in general, I don't think you're being explicitly evaluated, but you should always be respectful. You should always be kind to others around you. And it doesn't mean that, like, even if someone's not evaluating you, it doesn't mean they can't report you for inappropriate or like behavior or comments or something along those lines. So definitely, you know, you can ask about the things that you really want to know about the school, like about the culture, about like how collaborative it is. Like those are important questions that like you should ask, but you should always keep it respectful. That's just a good general rule in life too.
There are a lot of jokes online about how like every time you don't open a door for someone is like watching you or things like that. It is a joke. It's not real. It's just about being your most genuine self and being, again, like Anna said, respectful and kind. You are making first impressions just like you make first impressions every day of your life, and you want to put your best foot forward. So again, I think being genuine is more important than being like super polite. You don't have to say like please and thank you every single time if that's not who you really are, because again, like we talked about, you're trying to find out if you're a good fit for the school, and the school is also trying to find out if you're a good fit for them. So if you present yourself in an honest way, I think you'll get the most out of each and every one of those experiences.
I agree with everything that was said. Also, when you go to those events or like participate in them virtually, use it as a chance for yourself to evaluate the school as well. You can kind of see how the students are, how happy they are, you know, how many. I think sometimes I used to think to myself, like, oh, if I see a lot of medical students kind of attending these events, it makes me think, oh, they probably have like some time in their schedule to like help other people. They're not like studying all the time. So that was a kind of something I saw as like a positive. So yeah, use it as a chance to see what the community is like as well.
Absolutely. And I really want to emphasize the point that Audrey just made, in that the interviews are not only the opportunity for the school to evaluate you, but you to evaluate the school. A lot of times we think of that as sort of the second look, where it's like, okay, once I have an acceptance, then it's my turn to see if the school is right for me. The interview itself is still an opportunity for you to start that evaluation. Learn a lot from that interview, whether it's with other students, whether it's interacting with current students in the program, asking faculty members what they like or wish could change with the curriculum or anything like that. So it's definitely an opportunity for you as well. I do want to bring up a point that our amazing faculty mentor, Dr. Delangelica, made in our chat, and that was that a lot of us have sort of talked about some of our experiences where there might not have been the best interaction between us and an interviewing faculty member. And something that I would like you to know is that a lot of times after you are done with the interviews, the schools will actually send out a form where you can discuss anything that happens during the interview that perhaps went wrong, or if there was any disrespectful action. But it's not like a completely, I don't have the right word for it right now, but essentially there is a way for you to communicate if something has not gone appropriately in your interview session. So definitely keep that in mind, and feel free to use it at the end.
Yeah, like keep in mind there's a difference between someone challenging you and someone being just like disrespectful to you as a student. And so, you know, if you feel like it kind of crossed that line too far, you can absolutely report someone or like talk to the dean about it.
All right, so I think that's sort of our brief coverage of the traditional interview. I know we did not cover nearly enough to give you a complete sense of what those are, but we have a Q&A at the end as well, so please put any questions you have in the Q&A function. We're going to move on now to something a little bit different, and this is going to be the group or panel style interview. So these ones, as we mentioned before, it's a little similar to the traditional style interview, but there are going to be a lot more people present. The group interview is something that usually has a number of applicants. So you're all together in a room, and you might have one or more faculty members that pose questions to you. And then it's sort of a popcorn event, kind of like our panel right now, where each applicant then has an opportunity to answer that question. It certainly can be a little awkward, so definitely practice is always a good thing to prepare for that. But it's also a really unique opportunity for you to not only get to know the school through the faculty members, but also get a sense of what potential other members of an incoming class might look like. The panel interview is sort of like the flip side to that. So instead of being a lot of applicants and then maybe a few faculty, it's usually going to be you alone with a number of faculty members. And this can be even more daunting because you have many pairs of eyes sort of staring at you from maybe like a circle desk or something, and you don't know where to look, who to talk to, who to address. The important parts there that you really want to try to include everyone in that conversation. It's even though there might only be one person that's asking the questions, you really do want to maintain eye contact with everyone, keep them included, and when you have questions at the end, it's certainly okay to open it up to everyone involved. The questions that you can expect to be asked are probably along the lines of what you would get for a standard interview questions. But certainly there might be some unexpected ones thrown into the mix there as well. But of course, this is also a slight opportunity for the school to evaluate your interpersonal skills. So in the sense, for a group interview, you certainly want to be respectful of all the other applicants present. And then on the flip side, for the panel interview, certainly being respectful to all of the faculty members present. So we'll turn it back over to the panelists at this point. Could you describe any experiences that you have had or have heard about related to the group or panel interview?
So I didn't personally have any like group or panel interviews. I think they're relatively uncommon. But one thing to be prepared of, and we'll talk about this during the MMI session too, is that if you're in a group interview and you're with other applicants, like it may not be just straight questions. They could ask you to like perform a task together. I think a lot of people have encountered this during the MMI interviews, but this could also happen during a group interview where they like ask you to, I don't know, do a puzzle together or like solve something or work together to build something. And usually those, again, are evaluating like interpersonal skills and also communication. So you want to be like, I don't know, as communicative as possible and be able to explain like why communication is so important in healthcare and medicine.
So I was thinking really hard about this, and I realized that as part of one of my MMIs, I had a station where it was kind of like a group interview. It was 3 people and 1 faculty member in conversation. That's what they called it. And I think that, to me, it made a lot of sense to call it in conversation because it really isn't just 3 people talking separately to a faculty member. You're also talking to each other. So the way it worked for us was the faculty member just kind of threw out a conversation topic, and we talked about our personal experiences with it, if we had any thoughts, anything in the news, and it very much was a conversation. And I think it's very much true that they were judging not only our ability to interact with each other, but also to kind of think on the spot and be able to talk about different topics that aren't genuinely those usual interview questions, just generally like, oh, is there things that you're interested in? Are there aspects of health and public health and current events that you can talk about? But it was a pretty short experience overall. It was like the last station of an MMI. So I don't know if that was true for all group interviews, but that's all I can think of.
Unfortunately, I can't say much because I did not do any group interviews and actually haven't heard much about them. Even with my MMIs, I did them individually, but from what I'm hearing, it sounds like one of the ways they could evaluate you in this type of interview is to see how well you actively listen and engage with others. So one thing in medicine that's really important is to try not to cut people off when they're talking. You don't interrupt them. So that's just like the one major tip I guess I could give.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you guys. And yeah, you guys bring up an excellent point in the sense that these interviews are a little bit more uncommon. So I would say if you do get one, certainly it's something you need to prepare for, but it is usually not the norm in terms of medical schools. If you do get it, I have heard people being very stressed about it in the sense that they are sort of at their point in the room and then there's like this massive desk of people all staring at them. Again, sort of what I was talking about earlier, I would say really try to turn it into a conversation. Don't look at it as an interrogation between like 5 people all hammering you with questions. It's certainly okay to try to make it more conversational and address other people in the room. But I also did not have really any experience with those either. So that just sort of goes to show that, again, these are a little bit rare, but they do exist. So things to think about. All right, we will move on to our next segment here, and that is going to be an excellent segue from both what Audrey and Megan were talking about in the multiple mini interviews, or also known as the MMI affectionately. So these interviews are a sort of a different style, a different breed, and it usually consists of you being in a room with one, maybe two faculty members. There might be medical students involved if it's sort of a group activity, current medical students that might be evaluating you, but probably more likely faculty. But as Audrey and Megan were mentioning, there are also opportunities where you can be working in a group with other applicants. So what you can expect from these is that usually there is a brief period where you can read a prompt, and it's usually a pretty short one, and then you pretty much go into the room and you answer for 5 to 10 minutes. And these are especially stressful because it really prompts you to have some really quick thinking and come up with answers on the spot, since you don't really have any idea what to expect. But what you should know is that these are really fundamentally looking at your thought process. So they probably don't care so much about if you have the exact answer that they think about in terms of what they would do, but they want to know your process. So when you approach the MMI interviews, I think it's really important to walk through your steps very logically in terms of what you would do and why, because that reasoning is really going to provide a window for the interviewer into your thought process, what you would do in certain situations, and sort of what goes on in the inner workings of your mind. A lot of them are sort of in response to novel situations. So the types of prompts you can expect are things related to personal experience, situations. These are especially common, teamwork ones where you have multiple people doing something together. And then sometimes there are a little like controversial questions or ethics related questions that can dive pretty deep into some of the issues that face our healthcare right now. Again, these can also be very unexpected, so it's definitely good, but do know that some schools make it their like sole objective to come up with the most left field types of prompts that you have never really seen before, because they really want to know what you would do in a situation where you haven't had time to prepare. So these are some example questions you might expect to see. So an ethical question could be related to a situation such as a patient with needing a kidney transplant, and there being sort of the conflict of, on your end, you have an agenda, you really want to get this patient this life-saving treatment, but on the patient's end, there might be some other factors at play that are important to him. So it's a matter of balancing sort of what would you do and why. Again, your thought process is going to be the most important thing here, because you could probably fall on either side of the coin in terms of what you would do. Part of it all is why you think that way. Character development is also one. So I think one of the ones I had was sort of like the second one was, what is your greatest weakness and what have you done to improve upon it? Those are some things that you can expect. These are a little bit more in line with the traditional style questions, but nonetheless things to think about. The teamwork ones are especially interesting because it requires you to work with another applicant or applicants, and those are really honing in on your interpersonal skills, perhaps seeing you work under stress, doing things that you would not expect to have to do. I think one of them that I heard about was there were two students in a room. One was given instructions on how to fold an origami, like a crane or something, and then the other student did not have the instructions, but they had the origami paper. And so it was a matter of teamwork in terms of having one person communicate, okay, this is what you should be doing, and the other person trying to ask questions on how to move forward. So really, really interesting opportunities for the MMIs, definitely. There are some strategies here. I think Anna had provided these resources for us on the PowerPoint here. So maybe Anna, would you like to talk about these a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you see a question, these are just to like provide a broad framework of things that you could include in your response. It's definitely not like set by any means, but for example, if you had that ethical scenario in the last slide about the patient who needs the kidney transplant, you can use this to kind of explain your answer, and it's a good way to kind of outline, like Ryan mentioned, the thought processes. So it's just to remind you to explain those. So you explain the problem. So in that case, it's patient autonomy versus beneficence, which is two of the ethical principles of medicine. So like like do no harm, like justice, beneficence is like you should always be acting in the best interest of your patient. And if your patient really needs a kidney transplant, but the patient does have autonomy, and if they choose not to accept that kidney, you know, so you explain what the conflict is, explain what you would do, and then explain what other opinions might be and why you wouldn't choose to do those things. I've heard other advice that says you can kind of explain all options without choosing one, but I really think you should choose one in ethical scenarios. That's just a personal preference, but it kind of shows like directly where you would lean ethically. These are almost similar to Casper. If you've taken Casper too, you can use this type of framework. And then another model I've seen is the STAR model for past behavior. So if it's like, oh, tell me about, what was the question? Tell me about a time you made a mistake. So you can describe the situation, you can describe what actions you took, describe the results that happened, and then reflect on that experience. Was it the right thing? Did you do the right thing? What would you have done differently? So just a good way to like lay out those responses. If you're totally stumped, you're like, I don't know what to do. Just start by explaining both sides and then decide on an answer while you're explaining them.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, these are some general frameworks that you can use to work within the process. You can certainly develop your own frameworks, but these are things that you can sort of resort to if you have sort of that adrenaline rush, not thinking straight, and really need to have something to fall back on. So we will pause here and go to our panel. Could you explain some of your MMI experiences? So these could be things like the types of questions you were asked, any type of advice you have into how to prepare for an MMI, any of those types of things. And then we do have a couple of Q&A questions that we'd also like to address here. Maybe Megan, would you like to? Oh, Audrey wants to start. Audrey, go ahead.
Sorry, Megan. I think so. In terms of preparing for MMI, one of my biggest recommendations is to try to kind of read as many like ethical and like potential scenarios you could encounter as possible. I particularly use as like my main resource this book called The Multiple Mmi Interview. It's like kind of not that thick, and it's just written by an admissions person named Dr. Samir Desai. I don't know if any of the other medical students use that one, but it's essentially like this guide. It has like a bunch of potential questions that they might ask you in an MMI, as well as examples of responses that you could give. And they're actually kind of structured similar to what Anna was describing, kind of like the STAR format. And so I thought reading that whole book and annotating was really helpful because it gave me a sense of like, what's a good answer, what's a bad answer. And then you also kind of want to like watch YouTube videos of examples of scenarios that you could potentially encounter. But this is all to keep in mind that, you know, regardless of how much like studying you do, you might not, you know, encounter every single scenario that they may ask you about. But I think making yourself feel prepared, feeling confident is enough to kind of be ready for any type of scenario they could give you.
I really like Audrey's method. It's very structured. I wish I had thought of that when I went into this. I definitely was not as like, I guess, focused on how to do the MMI, more so just like getting used to the technique of it because it was so different from regular interviews that I'd ever done before. I think for me, I was just a little bit worried because it seemed like we had to talk for 5 minutes straight. And I was like, I don't know if I have that much material to talk about any one topic. And one thing that really helped me as I was going through the process was just thinking about all the different angles that you could take. You can include multiple examples. It's not like if they ask you about teamwork, you just have to pick one example. You have 5 minutes, so you can do 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever you think is the right amount that you can fully develop. And I think even for ethical type questions, it's the same thing applies, where you can have your opinion and not only state the other opinions and why you might not believe in them, but why someone might believe in them, and how you might have personal experiences with someone that has those opinions, how you fully understand that perspective given your personal relationship with them. And I think also really important, if they're still doing the same format, is that if there's someone asking a question, they will ask you like follow-up questions. So you're not in it alone. You don't have to go for 5 minutes just thinking of new things to say. Sometimes they'll probe you and prompt you with a follow-up question or 2 follow-up questions, especially if you miss something that they want. I think they are very helpful in trying to get you to whatever core I don't know, topics that they're evaluating. So you really aren't just like on trying to figure it out like, oh, I don't know if they want me to say this or that. They will guide you to some degree.
I like that a lot. I think, yeah, I was also really concerned about like talking for the whole time straight, but I'd say 9 times out of 10, it was more of a conversation. Like you started your answer, but then the interviewer would respond to you, which I was like concerned that that wouldn't happen, but it did. Also worth noting, this is like the type of interview where I had the most medical students interviewing me. Like, I don't think I had any other medical students interviewing me except for in MMIs. So just to be prepared for medical students, that might be your interviewer. And then I did not use a book like Audrey. That seems like a really good idea. But I did use, and I'll post a link to it in the chat, there's an article about like the principles of bioethics. So like I referred to on the last slide, just having a good knowledge of the 4 major principles of bioethics can really help you in understanding like why this is a difficult situation. Like, you know, in your mind it's a difficult situation, but it's a lot easier to describe it and like why it's a difficult situation when you understand these principles of bioethics. So I'm dropping that in the chat. It's like a article from the department, from UW, the bioethics department. So it's just an article that describes like the 4 main principles of bioethics. But also Audrey, maybe you can put the name of the book in the chat. But I thought that was really helpful in framing my responses. I also, since the MMI is usually administered, like it was invented by some Canadian school, I think, but I had the moral of this story, I had some repeat questions across schools, which was kind of nice. So you may encounter like similar questions or the exact same question a few times. And usually they're in the same kind of general theme about the ones we covered on the last 2 slides, like either ethical scenarios or like tell me about a time when, or different situations. And then, yeah, maybe teamwork, but that may look a little different this year.
Awesome. That's all excellent advice. My experience was actually quite different from what it sounds like all of you had. I didn't have any medical students interviewing me. They were all faculty members. And I actually had 0 conversations in my MMIs. So it was an entire monologue for every single one of my stations, which was a little daunting. So do know that it can sort of go on any end of the spectrum there. You read the prompt, you go into the room, and then it's a conversation. And then sort of on my end, I went into the room and they're just sitting there like stony faced, absolutely 0 expression, regardless of the answer you give. And like Megan said, they might probe you with a follow-up question if there's something they really want you to touch on. But besides that, for me, it was literally no reactions, no conversation with them on their part. It was just my explanation of the prompt. So you can get sort of a whole spectrum on that end. There were some questions in the Q&A that I think were particularly relevant. There was one about how MMIs might look in terms of the virtual setting. I think that none of us probably have any experience with this, so we probably can't give a definitive answer in that regards, but I would imagine that it would be similar to breakout rooms in a Zoom session if you've had that with your classes, and they might have a prompt run on the screen for a couple of minutes, and then they have an interviewer either present with video or maybe not, and then you would have your response provided in that regard. That'd be how I would imagine it. Any end of the panelists, do you have any ideas on how MMIs might look from a virtual setting?
Yeah, like Ryan said, I'm not totally sure, but I think one thing to keep in mind for the teamwork type scenarios in MMI, I think don't like rule them out yet just because they are virtual. I think it's totally possible to still do those types of scenarios online and virtually, because one of my MMI examples was instead instead of like a teamwork activity with another applicant, it was like with the interviewer themselves. And I think I'm sure schools can find a way to do that if they really wanted to. So continue to practice and still prepare as if it was an in-person interview.
I would say you could also reach out to schools if you have questions. So I would hope that they provide you with some sort of syllabus, or I guess syllabus is not the right word, some agenda for what your interview day will look like, and you'll know if you have an MMI style one or not. But if there is, it would be totally fine to reach out to the school and to ask for a clarification just to make sure. So that would be my best recommendation there. I'm not sure if AMCAS has any specific guidelines on that. I can look around and see, but at present, I'm not sure. We had another question in the Q&A also related to ethical questions. Was it just sort of like an explanation of your thought process, or was it a role-playing style? So that's a very interesting one. I think from my experience, it was all just questions and conversation, or I guess monologue on my end. But I never had a role-playing one. However, I have heard of them existing. So it is possible that I think you could walk in and have a scenario presented to you in the prompt, and then you walk in maybe talking to a person acting as a patient or acting as a doctor or something like that. So did any of you guys have experience with a role-playing one?
Sorry, before you get into that, I'm heading out to get to anatomy, but if anyone has any like lasting questions for me, I put my email in the chat, but it was really great being part of this panel. Enjoy the rest of the session.
Okay. I definitely did have both in my experience. For the role-playing ones, what often happened was that there was someone there, like a standardized patient type of person, who was acting and doing the role play with me, and there's someone else evaluating. In my experience, I know that's not the case for all role-playing situations, but I think that helped them separate the person who's watching and looking at my interactions from the person that was really getting into the acting and really feeling their character. And I think for those, it's definitely just like, you know, being in the moment and acting as you genuinely would. It's much less of, it feels less like an interview than some of the other questions. Like as Ryan was saying, a lot of the monologuing type are just, you know, a long segment of you talking and then maybe some follow-up questions, versus this is a full conversation. Like the actor will, or the standardized patient will be pretending to be whatever the character entails. And that being said, I actually didn't have any where the actor was an actual patient. They were more like role playing a friend or role playing a coworker rather than health and medicine. And one of the schools actually told me that they choose not to do that because they don't want us to feel like we have to give medical advice, which we're not qualified to do as a pre-med applying to medical school. But I think that, again, that's school specific, but I did enjoy that perspective from them.
Yeah, I didn't have any role-playing ethical questions either, but like Megan said, I had heard of situations where, you know, you might be interviewing like a standardized patient with someone evaluating you, like a third person evaluating you. So it's totally possible. I think one way to kind of, since you don't really know for sure what's going to happen, you want to kind of prepare for everything. Megan and Ryan know I'm like really intense about these types of things, but so for example, what I did was I kind of roped in like my roommate last year, and I had her pretend to be a patient, and like we kind of walked through different ethical scenarios together. And I, you know, we would like do the scenario for however long, and then I would get her feedback from it, and then we would do it like a different way where I would kind of describe to her what I would have done, and then she would kind of pretend to be the evaluator instead of like the patient. So I think what helps is just trying to, you know, prepare yourself for what could potentially happen. Just because, like, for example, I didn't have that type of role-playing situation doesn't mean necessarily it won't come up for you, and you want to be as prepared as you possibly can.
Awesome. I would even say that the virtual setting might lend itself more easily to role-playing types, because you could have someone that just sort of shows up and it's like a telemedicine interview. So I would say that's entirely possible as well. So just sort of something to keep on your radar. One thing I did want to mention, we're going slightly over time on this section, but I think it's important to mention, is that the MMIs can come in a wide range in terms of the length. So some of them are full MMIs, and those I think are usually about 8 stations, one of which is oftentimes a break station where you can like sit down, get a nice breather or whatnot. Some of them are half MMIs, where it's maybe 3 or 4 stations. So it can be variable in terms of what to expect. But for either sort of like high intensity training where you're jumping from station to station to station. So it's not like the traditional interviews where you might have maybe a 10-15 minute break in between. They're pretty back to back. Cool. All right. So we will jump into our last sort of interview style section here, and that is going to be the vita, which I'm sure many of you might be having questions about since this is probably relatively new. So this is probably the newest style of interview. I don't think any of us have had it before since it's so new, but it is something that is coming online now. And essentially, this is going to be interaction between you and your computer. There is not going to be any interviewer on the other end listening to you, at least in person. So it's essentially your computer recording it, and it's based through a software that you get invites to when you have an interview. The types of questions are, I guess, what you should expect in these. There are going to be 6 questions, and these are based on medical competencies. We will be providing this PowerPoint to you, and so you can access sort of the references we provided here. But there are some medical competencies that have been listed as sort of the target areas that will be the basis for the questions you receive for these. And they're very short. I guess you could sort of consider it like a short MMI where you have 1 minute to read a prompt and then 3 to answer. So it's a little bit similar to that in that regards, but the difference is that everyone usually will get different questions. So if you and your best friend both applied to one school and you both got vita invites, you might get completely different questions than that person. So it's very variable in that regards. And the other difference from MMIs is that these are something that you can complete on your own time. So instead of having someone on the other end listening to you and having an assigned time, like, oh, you better be here at 1 p.m. to talk to Dr. So-and-so, these are things that you can say, okay, the deadline is like in 3 weeks. I'll do 1 today, I'll do 2 tomorrow, and then whatnot. So you can sort of decide when you want to do it as long as it's before the deadline, and you can take any length of break in between. So it's not back to back like the MMIs. These ones, again, I would say go to the websites to look at sort of what competencies are that they're looking for, but the types of questions you would probably see are, again, similar to MMIs with personal experience, past behavior, situational. And a key here is that you can use hypothetical scenarios. So you might get a prompt asking you about something that you have never experienced before, and it is entirely fine to talk about something as if it were to occur and then sort of describe what you would do in that regards. A little bit more on sort of the vita. These are the competencies that we've listed. Again, I would really encourage you to go to the website though to read up on these a little bit more, but this is just sort of what they're looking for. And you really have, there could be questions that maybe hit on one of them only or perhaps address multiple ones in parallel. So it is sort of a diversified type of upon the role of an MMI and expanding it a little bit. And just know that these might be a supplement or a substitution interviews. So some schools might be using these as a screening tool before they offer sort of the regular interviews, whereas other schools might use this sort of as an part of your interview process. So it could be in any regards there. These are types of questions that you could expect to see. I think these are the ones provided on the website or examples. But you can see that they're sort of similar to what you might see in a traditional interview, like why did you decide on medicine, or when did you experience something that perhaps didn't go the way you expected or wanted it to. Again, sort of things to prepare for, but a really interesting thing is that the WMC has actually provided sort of an opportunity for you to get a practice session with the software. So if you go to their website, they will have sort of a link for that so you can get a sense of what the real thing would be like. Cool. So we're going to go into virtual interviewing tips here. So I sort of spent some time last night taking some pictures of myself, and I hope to make this a little bit interactive. So we are going to make an exception here and use the chat. If you could just sort of type some random or not so random differences that you might see between these photos. We'll just sort of keep it open for a couple minutes. Go nuts, like anything different that you see that might be the basis for making a virtual interview a good interaction or a not so good interaction. We'll give a couple minutes here. Any brave takers? Nice. Nice, nice. Awesome. All right, background, eye contact, dress code, looking at the camera, lighting, hair, angle, eye contact, professionalism, hair. Awesome. These are great. The left one has really obvious quarantine. Yes, it certainly does. All right, great. So you guys pretty much hit the nail on the head there. These are, one of them, it was graininess or sort of resolution. So on the left, that I took with my sort of older laptop, and you can definitely see that there's a resolution or quality difference. So if you do have multiple different devices, it could be useful to test out which one has the best resolution, just to provide the best interview experience for the people that you're talking to. The right one was taken with my iPad, so a little bit of a better quality there. A number of you mentioned the background is important as well. So on the left, there are a bunch of things going on. There are sharp corners and edges that could draw the interviewer's eye away from you. There's sort of like a distracting little thing in the background here. This is an accumulation of pins from a science fair thing that I had way back in high school. So a bunch of opportunities to get distracted for the interviewer in this regard here. But on the right side, really, there's nothing going on in the background. So it sort of forces you to have to look at me, or I guess you, in the interviewer setting. Hair is something that a number of you mentioned as well. The left one certainly has quarantine hair. There's like zero effort to try to make it presentable. And on the right, this is something that is a little more professional and acceptable. So that's probably something like a no-brainer. Lighting is also very important though. And this one I think might be not so intuitive. So these are all things that you should really pay attention to when you're setting up for an interview where you're talking to someone else or being recorded, and it being a bit to set up your station, if you will, to be the best combination of all of these aspects. So on the left here, there's like a bright light on one side of my face, and then it's a little bit more shadowy on the other side, whereas on the right, it's a little bit more consistent. If you're astute, you might see that there's a slight shadow on this side from my head because there was a light that I was not positioned exactly straight on, but it's hardly noticeable given the background. Angle is also really important. So with the left one, I actually was looking at an entirely different screen. And so if you are looking at a different area where you have maybe your recording set up or whatnot, but your eye contact is seen as not being related to the interviewer as if it was an organic conversation, and that can have some detrimental effects. Whereas on the right, you want to be looking sort of straight at the webcam if possible. Apparel, also sort of a no-brainer, definitely something to consider. One thing I do want to note here is contrast is actually key. So in med school, we have something called doctoring, which is where we learn how to talk to standardized patients to prepare for our real patients. And one thing that one of my tutors mentioned was that contrast of your apparel with the background is actually very important. For us, we wear white coats in these settings, and if you have a light background, then it's possible for you to sort of start to bleed into that background. So if you are able to generate some sort of contrast in terms of your profile and what's going on behind you, then that will make it a little bit easier for the interviewer to sort of pay attention to you. Frame is also really important. So this sort of goes along with the background and a couple of things that will show up a little bit later, but the size of the frame is key, the positioning of the frame is key. It's also related to the angle. Here, maybe it would have been better if I changed the size of the frame to fit just my face instead of having sort of any of this other stuff going on. Nonverbal communication is also something that you want to be aware of. And this was another point that one of my doctoring tutors mentioned. With virtual interviewing, in any regards, you have less opportunity for your movements to be seen, whether it is your head, your torso, your hands, or whatnot. So I was trying to make sort of the same hand motion sort of that I am now, and you might be able to see it in the small video to the side if it exists. But on the left side here, you can only sort of see the tips of my fingers, where on the right, you can see essentially the entire movement that I was going for. So having a good idea of what space you need in order to make any nonverbal cues that might aid your presentation to the interviewer will be key as well. So good to test it out to see sort of what kind of space you like to have, what kind of space you need to have with regards to the background as well, making sure there aren't things that are distracting. And then eye contact, you guys also mentioned. Essentially, I think you guys probably hit all of these, so it was really, really good. excellent job on that. But again, the webcam position is not always in the same spot as where your video might be showing up for you or the other person. So if possible, you want to make those as close together as you can, just so it's not perceived as you looking away from the interviewer per se. So that sort of wraps up sort of what we have in terms of the and whatnot. So actually, we're going to open it up to our Q&A session at this point. I will stop sharing my screen and we'll just go into looking at the Q&A. So I think we were able to answer a number of them. At this point, you guys can sort of spam the Q&A with anything that you might have questions about. Also look through the answered questions to see if there's stuff we could go over here. Is a traditional interview more like a conversation where we should be brief with our answers and hope they ask follow-up questions, or is it more of a one-way interview where they cover the bases and they don't ask for follow-up? So I guess Audrey and Megan, did you guys have experiences where it was an organic conversation, or was it more of a one-way interview where you did most of the talking?
I think it depends on the school. So I had a little bit of both. So some schools will, well, this is what I think happens on the back end. I think some schools will instruct their interviewers to kind of make it more conversational, to kind of make it easier for the applicant to feel comfortable, whereas other schools might instruct their interviewers to be like, okay, stick to this, the script, like only ask the questions, don't really react. So it just depends. I think in terms of how long you want to answer the questions for, in general, I think you should try to keep it to like 2 to 3 minutes at most, and try to cover like the major themes that you want to make sure that the interviewer knows about you and about your experience. And if they have follow-up questions, they will ask them for you. But I don't think you should count on them to ask a follow-up question. But you also don't want to like kind of ramble for too long, because then it dilutes your answer, and they're kind of gonna forget possibly like the major points of your answer. So try to keep it like around 2 to 3 minutes of a response, as if it were in an MMI kind of scenario. And then if they have further things they want to ask, you can then kind of share more details.
One thing I'll add is that sometimes it varies between open and closed file interviews, where if they don't know anything about you, it's going to be more conversational, because they're not just going to they're not going to have specific questions prepared. But I noticed that when they had really reviewed my application, there were definitely more like pointed questions that I had to answer that they weren't really giving me a lot of conversation about. But I think, usually you can tell pretty early on what kind of interview it will be, because, you'll see the kind of questions they'll ask you.
Definitely. And actually, Audrey reminded me, or it was one of you who mentioned the MMIs. One thing I wanted to mention for MMIs, don't feel pressured to fill the entire time frame with your response. They might say you have like up to 5 or 10 minutes to respond. And, if you're done at 3 minutes, then it's probably better to just sort of close your answer, again, sort of be concise, conclude with your thought process, and then exit the room, as opposed to trying to fill up that space with extra fluff that sort of like, actually, like you don't want it to sort of drag on. So don't feel the need to fill that space. Sorry, that was a brief tangent there, but sort of remember it there. I would also say that, again, sort of as Megan said, you will get a sense very early on of what type the interviewer will be and sort of their experience in knowing about you. And I would use that to your advantage, because some interviewers will be very conversational. They'll want to interrupt you in response and ask a follow-up question about something. They might go completely off tangent in a different direction, and they originally wanted to know why medicine, and now they dog Fifi or something. Like it can go really anywhere. So some of them will be like that, and then others might be just sort of stony-faced. Let me listen to your entire response and then give you another question afterwards. So usually you can get a sense probably in the first several minutes, and I would actually say use those first several minutes to gauge how long your responses should be. So if you have someone who is sort of the latter type that I mentioned, where they ask a question and they just sort of sit back and wait for you to talk, for those questions, it might be okay to go a little bit longer. But for someone who's very conversational, they might want to jump in with questions in the middle and in that regards. And so you might want to keep the responses in that case a little bit shorter. So just sort of get a sense on the personality of your interviewer and use that to your advantage. We also had some questions here showing up. So what were some of the questions you asked for your interview? So the faculty asked us a bunch of questions, but what are some of the questions you as pre-medical applicants were able to ask during your interview?
Like 90% of the time, if it was a faculty interviewer, I asked what they did to create balance in their lives and what kind of hobbies they were able to cultivate during med school and that they were still able to do now, just because I think it's relevant to anybody, and many interviews discuss some of the difficulties that come with med school, so it's a good way to transition that and end on a positive note. And it's always a great conversation starter because, you know, I met interviewers that did horseback riding or, you know, were also really into film. So either there's something in common that you can discuss or something you don't know anything about where you can ask follow-up questions about that. It's not school specific, obviously, but I think it shows real interest in your interviewer. And if you are going to write a thank you note to them, it's a great way to get more information about them to mention, to make it more personalized.
Yeah, I agree with what Megan's asked. So some of the questions you can ask are maybe more about what the interviewer's experience was like, and also potentially trying to find areas of interest. Some potential school-specific questions you could ask. I know some things that I did was, like, if there was a particular program at the school or something unique about the curriculum that I genuinely wanted to learn more about and I couldn't necessarily get a good sense of it from students or from the website, I would ask that during the interview because it showed that I did my research on the school, that I see myself engaging in those specific and unique programs to the school. So that's kind of the approach that I took. Other times I would ask them, you know, what brought you to, you know, join the faculty at this school? What is it that you really like about the community here, and what do you not like about it? What have you found challenging in your job? So there's just like a lot of different ways you can kind of ask questions. Maybe see how your interview is going, see what you guys have talked about already, and then you can try to gauge what questions to ask based on that.
Definitely, I would second everything that has been said. Certainly, you want to have some questions in your back pocket in case you are provided the opportunity to ask questions, but having things based off of your conversation will also be really important. So if in the discussion, your interviewer casually mentions like, oh, like in the introduction to like, oh, I'm the director of the stem cell transplant program here. I'm your interviewer today, Dr. So-and-so, why medicine for you? And then you sort of gallop off into the races, right? But sometimes it's good just sort of keep in mind like, oh, you know, I'm actually really interested in, say, stem cell research. And I remember that this person said that they had a directorship position in that facility. So I want to learn more about that. That certainly shows interest, active listening as well. And keeping anything related to the school specifically will also be of benefit because, as Audrey said, it shows you've done your homework. It shows pointed interest in the school, not generalized like, oh, you know, what exists, what opportunities are there for people interested in global health? You know, that's an excellent question to ask. I'm not trying to bash that question, but it's oftentimes better to have a very specific pointed question about, you know, oh, I read about this program online and I really want to know sort of how it's been implemented in the last several years and if there are any sort of vision changes that are going to be moving forward. That really shows that dedication at the next level. So certainly a lot of things to consider there. But again, there are so many different types of questions to ask. Don't feel the need to ask any of the ones that we've talked about. You can probably have some that that are tailored to your specific experiences as well. All right, we have another question about any general tips on preparing for a first interview, since there's always that first one where everything is new and whatnot. So anything that you can say about preparing for that very first one? I guess I could start. One thing that I did was an insane amount of practice and practice in any type of atmosphere or environment in terms of the interviewer's personality. So I got my dad to be sort of my mock interviewer, and he just fired questions at me in some cases, like the most brutal interview I would ever encounter. Things like questioning my interest in medicine, questioning my like competence as a person, like anything that could go possibly wrong. And then on the other end of the spectrum, also being a very caring, interested interviewer, like, oh, you know, I saw that you had this on your application. Could you tell me more about it? So I would say if you can find people that can grill you on one end of the spectrum and then can sort of be that really, really like the ideal interview on the other spectrum, that would be a really good place to start because practice, I think, you know the phrase like practice makes perfect, right? I had my brother's music teacher actually argued against that phrase and said perfect practice makes perfect. So get as much practice as you can and hone your practice, because that will be sort of your stepping stone moving forward. But any tips you guys have for getting ready for that very first one?
If possible, just maybe like the day before, just take a breather. I know it's like super nerve-wracking and it feels so nervous. I know now people aren't flying out, but I had to fly out to my first interview. It was across the country and I was just so nervous like the whole time. And I think it would have really done me well not to be like preparing on the plane, which I was doing because I couldn't stop myself because I just felt like I had to prepare the whole time. I think I would definitely take Ryan's advice, practice a ton beforehand. You'll know at least a week, if not several weeks in advance of your interview, like when your slot will be. I believe that's still the case now. But yeah, like the day before or like when you're traveling, just do something happy, something fun. And if, it comes up and you're able to practice, that's fine too. And if that's something that helps you, that's great. But I think just separating yourself from the process for just a moment, as with anything, if you're studying for a test, it just gives you some clarity of mind and you won't be just running through these same answers over and over again in your head and questioning how you're going to answer or what you're going to say or how they're going to take your response. And the same thing goes for after an interview as well. Just take a breather. You don't need to think about the interview once it's done or before it starts.
Yeah, I agree. So practice a lot and also give yourself a break. I guess the only thing I will add is one thing that I found really helpful for not just the first one, but all of them, but especially for the first one was just like kind of getting into the mindset of like, okay, envisioning myself at the school that I'm going to be at. I don't know anything about what it looks like. I don't know what the people are like, but if I can kind of see myself there in some particular way and envision how I could be a fit there, I think it helps a lot in terms of making your answers sound genuine. Then you don't feel like you need to, have such a rehearsed answer. If you can kind of come across as like, oh, well, this is exactly how I see myself here. And you can kind of show like a passion for the program rather than kind of rehearsing over and over and like not really having any kind of genuine feeling towards it, if that makes any sense. So I think that's the only thing. And the other thing also actually is kind of focus on yourself. I know it's sometimes easy to think about, oh, I wonder how many other people they're interviewing today, or like, I wonder how the other applicants are doing. But honestly, it's probably easier over virtual anyway, but try not to think about them and just focus on yourself, the person in front of you, and the school that you're interviewing with. And don't compare yourself to other people, because it's really easy to do that.
Those are all phenomenal recommendations, and sort of in line with the taking a break theme. I would highly recommend having like a pre-interview routine that does not involve any type of prep. So for example, the song called High Hopes by Panic at the Disco was my theme song during interview season. And like to this day, whenever I hear it, I still think back to sort of the positive effect it had on me. Just whether it's listening to music or playing a game or just something that sort of that makes you feel at home, makes you feel nice and that kind of thing. Having a routine before a stressful interview, especially that first one, I think would be really, really helpful. So yeah, let's see. Is it better to restate answers from primary, secondaries to be consistent, or should we talk about something different? So sort of the conflict of, we've had the opportunity to talk about some facets of ourselves in the applications. Is it better now to be consistent with those in our interview, or should we try to talk about some new things? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great place to expand. I feel like with secondary, so many of us struggle with the word count. It's quite small, and sometimes you're cutting out all these things that when you first wrote it were super important to you. And the interview is a chance to build that out and really make it into the full experience that it was. And in that process, you're probably going to bring up other things as well. To me, I feel like secondaries just limit you so much in your answer, because usually it's like one thing led to another, and that's why you were a good leader, because you learned from 2 previous experiences and now it led to this. So I think in your interview, yes, you should still, I think, bring back those examples, because those were obviously what you decided were the very best examples and you took time to write about them. So you've already taken that first step. But I think you can definitely add to it to make it fresh, make it new, and also make it, again, so it doesn't sound rehearsed. It sounds like something that you're thinking about as you're telling your interviewer.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe use it as an opportunity to expand your answer. Another way is, if in the secondaries or in your primary application, you talked about an experience in a particular angle, but you wanted to talk about it in a different angle, but you just didn't have the word count, or like you might have diluted your answer. This is an opportunity for you to do that. So for example, I did like some global health work when I was in college. So in my application, I talked about sustainability and cultural competency. But then in my interview, I kind of alluded to that, but then I also talked about, like my passion for like serving underserved communities. So I kind of talked about it from a different angle, but still tied it back to what I had written in the application. So that way you can kind of remind them what they have potentially seen, but also show a different side of yourself that's different from the primary and secondary applications.
Yeah, for sure. For me, I think it really came about in the sense that there were, say, like with the work and activity section, you have only so much space to talk about it, and you have to pick your like top 3 ones, right? And a lot of the interview might focus on those top 3, but there are also other aspects of that that maybe you would have wanted to talk a lot more about. For me, it actually happened to be sort of a hobby of mine that is playing the hangpan, which is a really cool musical instrument. Go check it out if you don't know what it is. But for one of my interviews, like we were talking about things, and he had clearly read my application, and then he asked a question about the hangpan. And that 30-minute interview, about 5 minutes of it at the beginning was dedicated to medicine and sort of why I wanted to pursue that route. And then the remaining 25 were us just sort of having fun talking about the instrument. He even like brought up a video on his laptop that we looked at, and I was like telling him like who to follow on YouTube and whatnot. So you have an opportunity to really make a very lasting impression on your interviewers, especially with things that perhaps aren't so related to medicine, because the fact of the matter is that sometimes with these interviews, they might be having several students that they have to evaluate. And sometimes it might be difficult to remember which student was interested in global health, which student was interested in maybe like surgery or whatnot. And if there are some other facets in your application that you can really bring out and emphasize that you didn't get a chance to, that is certainly your opportunity to do so. Awesome. So we have another question here asking about if you can email or discuss with us about your experience with interviewing specifically for DGSOM. So this I'll take as an opportunity to plug the peer advising that we have available. So I will try to bring up a link for that really quickly. So this is something where you can sign up with Med Mentors and get a session where you can talk to us for like 30 minutes or something, and it can be on anything, whether it's essays or general questions or just advice about sort of life if it's not even medicine related. So anything is fine. I'm posting it in the chat right now. But I think in the context of sort of our setting here, maybe Megan and Audrey, you could talk about what were your experiences specifically at UCLA in your interview.
Full transparency, I also want to say that obviously our experiences can be very different from yours. I'm sure the tone and the type of interactions will be similar, but obviously the formatting is going to be very, very different this year. And so I hope our advice will still be helpful, but just take it with a grain of salt, because things can change drastically. And then I guess generally, as far as interviews, I can just say that my UCLA interview was my favorite interview and probably had a big impact on me even being here at UCLA now, which I think goes back again to our topic of like, this is the first chance you are evaluating the school as an applicant. So like really keep that in mind as you do have personal interviews. I like the format here as well because we kind of had like a little bit of MMI, a little bit of like faculty interaction. I thought it was a good blend. And overall, I think it was a shorter interview day. We weren't here for hours and hours with lots of presentations and things like that, which some schools, they start at 7:30 in the morning and they end at 4:30 in the evening, at least in the past. And I felt like UCLA kept it short and sweet and they just got across what they wanted to get across. More specifically, I think their MMI is really well built out, but I know that it's not really relevant right now because they're not going to be using that format this year. I don't know. And then faculty interview. So I don't know if Audrey, you have anything specific to add. I'm not sure how much will be similar.
Yeah, I was gonna say this is kind of the same, a similar thing, basically, that I mean, I also really liked interviewing at DGSOM. Like I also went to UCLA, so I was like kind of, I wasn't sure how I'd feel, I guess, kind of being back on campus and like seeing it again. But I think it was extremely welcoming. I remember like even for the traditional interviews, which I believe is I think all that they are doing this year in addition to Vita. I remember really liking the faculty that I spoke with. I think that UCLA does a great job of choosing and having people who speak to you who genuinely want to know who you are. It was very like, for me, very casual, a very conversational experience. And I really liked that because I don't like it when it's like really intense and they're just like staring at you. So I thought that they were really friendly and it really made for like a much more positive experience. And it was in fact a shorter day, like Megan said. So that was also nice. I was in and out in a pretty short amount of time. And one of my positive memories from this is that I had socialized with some of the other interviewees, and a handful of them are in my class. So it was really nice to kind of like see people again. So, you know, you never know who you're going to meet or interact with, whether it's like current students or like interviewees who might end up in your future again. So always, you know, be happy and try to like get to know people around you during your interview as well. But everyone was super nice and it made for a really great community experience.
Awesome. Yeah, I think my interview style might have been slightly different for the MD PhD track, but probably a commonality was in sort of the orientation. There's an amazing dean of our school named Dr. Clarence Braddock, and I remember very distinctly he got up to speak, excellent public speaker, and he mentioned that one of the missions of UCLA, specifically DGSOM at UCLA, was to produce great physicians and blank. And sort of to explain what that means is that essentially the mission statement for the school, at least in the way that he was envisioning it, was that UCLA doesn't want to just produce excellent clinicians and physicians, but to produce people who are able to translate those experiences into other realms as well. So whether it's advocacy, whether it's public works with the community, any of those things that sort of might be related but not overtly identical to sort of the medical training itself is really what they were aiming for. So if there are facets of your application that lend itself very well to that idea of being an excellent physician and blank, then that could be something really interesting to sort of emphasize in your conversation with faculty, because they certainly probably will be looking for something like that. But if you have more specific questions on the MD PhD side of things, I'm happy to go into that. But I think for the purposes of this session, we'll stick to sort of what we've gotten so far. We are looking to hold some dual degree sessions in the future. So if you're interested in the Prime program at UCLA or the MSDP, or I guess at other schools, I'm sure there are sort of analogs of those programs as well. We'll be trying to hold a session like that. With regards to us personally, I think Audrey has provided her email in the chat. I'll do the same. I think Anna added hers as well, and Megan will probably be throwing it up as well. But you can also go to that peer advising sheet if you want to set up sort of a one-on-one Zoom meeting to get that in-person experience as opposed to the faceless email communication. But yeah, so I think we're just at about time. Are there any last minute questions that people have? We might be able to get to maybe one or two, but if not, we'll just sort of call it a day. Let's see. It looks like that is about it. So let me add my email really quickly.